Henry, do you know what day Thursday will be? Thursday? The 21st. Yes, and what is special about the 21st? Thursday. Oh, Henry. Pretty Mrs. Waring looked sadly across the breakfast table at her husband, or rather at the newspaper that hid him from her view. Put down that paper for a moment. I never get to talk to you in the morning, and I spend the whole day alone. Do you really not know what the 21st is? The 21st? Mr. Waring looked at his wife with a blank face as he quickly drank his coffee. Then he glanced at his watch on the table. What do you mean, dear? Tell me quickly. I have to go. Henry, have you forgotten that it is our wedding day? Oh, said Mr. Waring, understanding now, with a note of relief in his voice. He stood up as he spoke. Forgotten that? Of course not. The day I married the sweetest girl in the world. How beautiful you looked, and how lucky I was to get you. Can you help me with my coat, dear? The sleeve lining, yes, I know you haven't had time to fix it yet. Now, dear, I would like to stay here and kiss you all day, but the train is coming. Bye-bye, dear. Take good care of yourself and the babies. His wife watched him fondly as he walked down the path to the gate, strong and quick. She waved as he looked back and smiled before joining another man hurrying for the train. She could almost see him forget about the little house as he turned away, ready for the busy workday. But this morning Mrs. Waring did not feel sad as she watched him go. She was too happy with his words. They might seem simple to others, but to her, they meant a lot. She remembered herself as a bride beside her groom on their wedding day, and she believed he felt the same love and memories. She fell into a happy dream about the past until she heard little feet upstairs and remembered she was needed in the nursery. Mrs. Waring had, without telling her husband, been planning a celebration for their wedding anniversary. They hadn't celebrated it for a couple of years, but she decided that Henry must suggest it, not her. If she had to plan it, like she did their move to the country, their trip to the beach last summer, or the Christmas party for the babies, it would mean nothing to her. If he didn't love her enough, if he didn't care about her happiness enough to think of pleasing her without being reminded, there would be no celebration. She didn't want to mention it this morning, but she knew he would never remember if she didn't. She hoped that once he remembered the date, he would plan the rest. She thought about nothing else all day. She told little Henry about her pretty wedding once upon a time, when she wore a beautiful white dress with a long white veil and walked up the church aisle when the organ played, and the front of the church was full of roses and palm leaves. Although Henry only asked if there were any bears or lions there, the little maid, Beezy, was very interested. Mrs. Waring knew that, while she seemed to be talking to Henry, she was really showing off for Beezy. She even got out her wedding jewels to hang around baby Marjorie's neck, to see Beezy's amazed admiration. It was hard to say why this wedding anniversary was so important to Mrs. Waring. Both she and her husband had been surprised to find that they were still truly in love with each other, instead of just being good friends like people told them they would be. But lately, there had been some tension. After the first year, which is not always the hardest despite what people say, after the first boy and the first girl and the first house in the suburbs, life can become routine and sometimes challenging. Mrs. Waring greeted her husband that night with a look full of meaning, and eyes that looked up to his with deep emotion. He should have known something important was on her mind. She felt that even their simple words were filled with hidden feelings. When he finally said to her, after dinner, as they sat by the small fire, "I have a surprise for you, dear," her heart jumped with joy, and she felt he really understood her. "What is it, Henry?" "Mother, Aunt Eliza, Mary Appleton, and Nan are coming here for lunch the day after tomorrow, Thursday. I told them you'd be happy to have them. Is that okay?" "They're coming on Thursday." "Yes. That isn't a washing day or a cleaning day, is it?"
No.
Mr. Waring looked confused. "You've mentioned so many times that they haven't visited in the whole year we've lived here. I thought you'd be happy, dear." "Henry, why do you never call me Ethel anymore? You used to say it was the most beautiful name in the world, and now you seem to forget that I have a name." "Oh, if you knew how tired I get of always being called doll. It sounds so awful and common." "Why, dear? There it is again. Ethel, my dear girl, don't cry. If I had any idea, I always seem to do the wrong thing lately. Why can't you tell me what you want sometimes? If you don't want my mother and the girls, just say so. I can tell them tomorrow, and if you do." Mrs. Waring stood up sadly with one hand on her husband's shoulder. "I wouldn't let that happen for anything." She gasped in horror at the thought. "But, oh, Henry, you almost kill me sometimes." "No, if you don't know why this time, I will not tell you again." She leaned her head against her husband as if very tired, and let him pull her down to sit beside him again. "You never think of me anymore." "But I do think of you, sweetheart." He patted her head gently. "Lots of times, when you don't know it. If you'd only tell me what you want, dear. I'm not good at guessing. And I know you really do want to see my mother and show her the children." "It's the fourth time she has said she was coming," said his wife thoughtfully. She was already planning what to do to get ready for the guests. When you are a young housekeeper with small children and only a nursemaid and a cook to help, a day with guests means changing everything in the house. In the city, people come and go easily, and the household doesn't need much preparation. But in the country, before guests come to spend the day, the whole house must be cleaned and tidied from top to bottom. As Ethel Waring cleaned the house, she remembered that she had done this 3 times before for Henry's mother, who had not come each time. She felt proud of liking her mother-in-law, and Henry's sister Nan was her special friend. But Aunt Eliza and Mary Appleton were the kind of people who always noticed everything in the house. Now, she cleaned for the 4th time, feeling generous. Since she had moved to the country, she found it strange that her friends and family saw the half-hour journey by train and ferry as a big deal, planned for weeks ahead. Even after living in her cottage for over a year, she still expected people to come when they promised. There was something tough and sacrificial in her cleaning now that helped her deal with her disappointment. Her husband could not remember what made her happy, but she was working hard for his family. She had nothing to look forward to but being ignored. And the worst part was that he would not even know he was ignoring her. Maybe, though, he did remember. She watched everything he said and did until the morning of their anniversary. He was so happy and cheerful, trying to make her smile, that she could hardly resist feeling happy too. But after he said his cheerful goodbye, She felt like the sad years ahead had started. There was no time to feel sad, though. The two children had to be bathed and put to bed for their morning nap, which she and Beezy hoped would be a long one. They had to finish cleaning, set the table, make the salad dressing, whip the cream for the jelly, and she needed to dress up and be in the living room before 12 o'clock. There was the usual panic when the butcher was late with the chickens, and they found out the greengrocer had not brought what they ordered. They had to send Beezy to the village at the last moment for the missing lettuce, only to find out there was none in town that day, a fact that was very frustrating for a suburban housekeeper. But finally, everything was ready. The table was set perfectly, the living room curtains arranged nicely, the logs burning in the fireplace, the chairs set cozily, and the vase of flowers giving a lovely brightness to the room, hinting at the coming spring. The babies, sweet and fresh, in their whitest dresses and hair curled, ran up and down and played beside their pretty mother, who sat with her embroidery in hand, feeling a bit satisfied through her sadness. But after Harry had peeked out from the curtains about 20 times to see if Grandma was coming, and little Marjorie had fallen and gotten a bump on her forehead, and the 1 o'clock train had come in, things changed. The cook asked if she should start cooking the oysters, and Mrs. Waring said no, to wait until the next train, even though it didn't arrive until 2 o'clock. She pretended her guests had missed the earlier train, but in her heart she felt sure they would not come. As she sat eating lunch alone, wishing she knew her neighbors well enough to ask them to join her, she got a late telegram from her husband. It said, "Nan says party postponed. Aunt Eliza has headache." She read it and threw it away angrily. And this was her wedding day, spent doing unnecessary work, getting ready for people who didn't care about her. Oh, if only she had gone to the city that afternoon, as she had dreamed. She wanted to have a little dinner with Henry at a nice place and go to a show afterward. She didn't care where, just a happy time together. She hadn't been anywhere since little Marjorie was born. She was surprised to have a visitor in the afternoon, Mrs. Livermore. This visitor was a large woman with very blonde hair, who lived on the corner. She was dressed in fancy clothes and sat in the small living room as a big mass of purple cloth and fur and shiny decorations, with feathers on her hat, making Mrs. Waring look very small and plain. Mrs. Livermore said sorry many times for not visiting before because she was sick, and then she talked a lot about all the illnesses she had, which made poor Mrs. Waring feel pale. The only good thing in her life seemed to be her husband, who she said was the best nurse. "I didn't know if I'd find you at home this afternoon," she said. "Your nurse girl, Beezy, told my cook that this was your wedding anniversary. Willie and I used to go out for a little treat, but since I've been so sick, I've had to stay home. But he never forgets. Every Saturday since our marriage, 14 years ago, he has brought me home a box of flowers. He always says, 'Here are your roses, baby.' That's his special name for me. I don't know what I'd do if Willie wasn't so thoughtful." "Really?" said Mrs. Waring. When she went back to the nursery, she scolded Beezy for talking too much. Beezy defended herself loudly. "In a small house, you become close to your nursemaid. I only said 2 words to Ellen, but Mrs. Livermore, she finds out everything. And the way she and Mr. Livermore argue. But she says he is so kind to her," said Mrs. Waring without thinking. He brings her flowers every week. She sighed, thinking of her own husband who didn't bring flowers even once a year. Him. Ah, ma'am. Ellen says they fight like cat and dog. And just a week ago on Monday, the plates were flying so much in the dining room. Ellen didn't dare put her head in to take away the meat. Ellen says it would have scared you to hear them. The neighbors have complained about them in court. He drinks a lot. You must not tell me these things, Beezy, said Mrs. Waring with dignity. I do not want to hear them. Come, Marjorie, sweetie, play pat cake with Mommy. Like this, baby darling. Oh, Beezy, there's the bell again. This time it was a neighbor Mrs. Waring had met before and liked a bit, a gentle, quiet, kind woman who liked the children. Mrs. Waring shared some of her household problems with her, and they talked about the village markets and compared prices. They even talked about more personal things. Mrs. Waring finally told her that today was her wedding anniversary, and her guest congratulated her. I had hoped to celebrate the day in town, she added quickly, but Mr. Waring's work stopped that. It must be really sad for you, said her visitor kindly. I often think how lonely you must be, knowing so few people. A man so seldom realizes what a woman's life is like. He goes off to work every morning, not thinking about all she has to go through during the day. I often see you looking after your husband when he leaves in the morning. You look so longingly, dear. I said to Mr. Morris just the other day, I wish Mr. Waring would look back just once at his sweet young wife. Mr. Morris always turns at the corner and waves his hand to me. Maybe you've seen him, dear fellow? Mrs. Waring felt cold toward this too kind visitor, who soon left, but her words left a hidden sting. Her voice sounded sad when she told Beezy that she would order her meat from Einstein, as Mrs. Morris said his prices were lower than O'Reilly's. Mrs. Morris, ma'am, sang Beezy. Ah, ma'am, you wouldn't want to eat the kind of stuff she does. It's not a roast of beef that goes in that house from one week to another. Nothing but little scraps that wouldn't keep a dog alive. Mr. Morris, poor man. He's so thin and weak. Oh, she has all the money, and she keeps him so close. Ellen says it's only a quart of milk that goes to them for 5 days, and only one shovelful of coal allowed to be put on the furnace at a time, and him with the cough that's tearing his heart out. Ellen says, That will do, Beezy, said Mrs. Waring firmly. The gossip of servants, the small talk, and silly pity of common neighbors. Was this all that was left to her? She went downstairs again and sat in the drawing room, inside the window curtains, and cried. The darkening sky seemed to show the sadness that would fill her future years. If people wouldn't feel sorry for her, she might be able to live. At least the children would love her. 6 years ago, she was so happy. How lovely his eyes looked when he gave her that first married kiss. She could still smell the bride roses she had held. She heard the children's footsteps upstairs and tried to wipe away her tears. A quick step on the path outside surprised her, and the gate closed with a loud noise. Could it be? Her husband was running up the steps with something white in his hand. An enormous bunch of white roses. Another moment, and he was by her side, smiling down at her. Oh, how handsome he was. How soon can you get ready, doll? I've got tickets for the opera tonight. Romeo and Juliet, Emma Eames and Jean Duresca. Do you like that? Oh, Henry, I've brought some flowers, and we'll have a great time. I've ordered a cab from the station to be here in 20 minutes, and we'll have to get dressed and grab a bite to eat. I wanted to come out earlier, but I wasn't sure about the tickets until the last moment. We'll have a little supper after the opera and take the 1:10 train back. What do you think about that? Oh, Henry, I thought you had forgotten. I thought, but there was no time to talk. Could she ever forget that delightful, exciting, hurried 20 minutes? She spent 5 of them fixing her hat, to her husband's amazement, her quick fingers pulling off bows and feathers and putting them back again very fast. She ate a sandwich while dressing and giving directions to Beezy about the babies. When they finally sped off in the small cab to the railway station, they were like two happy children, excited for the fun ahead. The opera. Had they ever gone to any opera before? How amazingly beautiful and bright the theater. The lights. The happy crowd to the couple who usually lived in the suburbs. Together they looked at the glamorous women in the boxes and pointed out to each other the ones they knew. And when Gounod's wonderful music touched their hearts, and Mrs. Waring sat with her bride roses in one hand, and the other secretly holding Henry's under her wrap, was any woman ever happier? Had any girl ever had a lover more devoted or more fun-loving? Romeo and Juliet. What were they to a real married couple of today? Then the supper afterward with the happy crowd at the Waldorf, the carefree ignoring of the midnight train. Could there be more fun? It was when they stood outside on the ferry boat, coming home, that Mrs. Waring finally spoke the thought closest to her heart all evening. They were alone in the front. The cold night wind blew refreshingly. The dark water splashed around them, and across its black surface, the colored lights shone faintly from the New Jersey shore. Mrs. Waring leaned a little closer to her husband as they stood there in the night and darkness. "Dear," she murmured, "I can't tell you how lovely the evening has been. But you know what has made it so special to me, what has made me so very happy. The opera and the supper would have meant nothing without it. Darling, it's because you thought of it all yourself." A sudden tension in the arm on which she leaned startled Mrs. Waring. She bent forward to look up into her husband's face with a quick suspicion. "Henry? Well, doll, didn't you think of it yourself? Nobody could have enjoyed our time together more than I have. You know that, doll, and nobody could want to make you happier than I do. What's the use of picking the whole thing to pieces now and spoiling it all? Henry Waring, you haven't answered me. Did you remember that this was our wedding day, or did you not? Who told you to take me out tonight? If you will not tell me these things yourself, Ethel, it's mean of you, dear. It puts me at a disadvantage when you remember and I don't. Heaven knows that I ought not to forget anything that would make you happy. That's true. But I'm not mean on purpose, and you are. You know, but don't let's quarrel tonight." "Quarrel?" Mrs. Waring lifted her head indignantly. "As if I wanted to quarrel. Who was it told you, Henry?" "Well, Ethel, if you must know. Nan was in the office today to say they couldn't come, and she—" "Nan, your sister Nan." Like a flash, Mrs. Waring saw it all. She knew Nan's impulsive, wholehearted way. But one of Henry's family. Life could have no further joy for her. She looked at him furtively as he stood beside her, gazing sadly out across the water. Were they quarreling? Would they end up throwing plates at each other someday? His posture was comically dejected, despite herself and the tears that had been ready to well up in her eyes a moment before. A sudden sense of the absurdity of it all came over her, and she broke into a refreshingly unexpected peal of laughter. Her husband stared, then laughed too, in delighted relief. "Ah," she murmured, with her cheek against his coat sleeve, "I suppose I'll just have to love you as you are." "If you only would, dear," he agreed humbly. The lights on the New Jersey shore shone brighter and brighter now, yellow and red and green, casting their reflection on the black, lapping water below. The boat was nearing the dock. All unbidden with the last words had come a deep joy, a thrill from heart to heart, wonderful in its illuminating power. The warm silence that followed was an instant blessing to their unspoken vows. The chains clanked in the dock. As they stepped across the gangplank toward the dark, waiting lines of cars beyond, he pressed her hand in his as he bent over her, and whispered in tender playfulness, "Shall we take the train for Washington or Philadelphia?"